and welcome to our Halloween Spectacular. We are the LGBTQI plus Heritage Project, and tonight we're going to have some of our volunteers and some of our friends in to share some spooky queer-related stories for you. My colleague Joe is going to explain why Selwyn and Halloween are actually a queer holiday name. Happy Halloween, everyone.
There's a lot going on in the world right now, and in the communities under the LGBT plus umbrella are facing ever evolving struggles. So it might seem frivolous then for us to spend time thinking about a holiday like Halloween when so much work is yet to be done. But joy is a profound act of resistance, especially in difficult times. And what better way to celebrate than unconditional, uplifting, and radical joy? Then looking back at the history of Halloween, so popularly known as Queer Christmas. There are many narratives around the holiday, but some important moments are worth highlighting to understand why it resonates so strongly with the LGBTQ plus communities and why modern celebrations owe so much to queer traditions. For starters, the roots of Halloween are connected to the Gaelic pagan festival of Samhain. The pagan nature of Halloween thus provided a safe home for people who were already being treated as outcasts. This in turn led to a safe, or at least safer space for the revelers in the 1970s America, especially in the Castro district in San Francisco, which appears to be the epicenter of gay culture in America. At a time when pride was still an unwelcome protest, with often illegal queer and queer-friendly street parties unheard of, Halloween celebrations in the district allowed for the public display of subverting local social norms without judgment. Led by a combination of nightclubs, drag and ballroom houses, and informal community spaces, people were able to safely explore a range of experiences from gender expression to kink and beyond, all while using "it's just a costume" as a valid excuse when challenged. The Castro Halloween traditions eventually expanded across the USA and then across the Western world. The public commercialization of Halloween with its candy, trick and treat only evolved afterwards when it became clear that these street parties were not only safe and fun, but also quite lucrative. It's now a major celebration across the world, including in countries where LGBT plus rights are still illegal. But it is because of the bold actions of the LGBT plus community organisers, trans and gender diverse housing collectives, drag performers, and cross dressers with an undiminished need to be able to celebrate proudly that Halloween has become as entrenched as it is today. So, in the spirit of celebrating our past and looking to a brighter future, we would like you to enjoy the following short stories.
So this is an extract from The Vine Witch by Luann G. Smith, Chapter 1. Her eyes rested above the waterline as a moth struggled inside her mouth. She blinked to force the wings past her tongue, and a curious revulsion followed. The strangeness of it filtered through her toad brain until she settled on the opinion that it was best to avoid the wispy yellow-winged ones in the future. Unperturbed, she propelled herself into the murky shallows to nestle among the reeds. As her body absorbed the late-season sun seeping through the half-naked trees, she let her eyelids relax. But with the sun's energy came new hunger. She swiped a forelimb across her mouth and considered hunting for snails along the mud bank when a second particularity pricked her instinct. Shapes and colours intensified in her vision, and not merely by a seasonal trick of the light. A brown leaf fluttered onto a ripple of black water. A silverfish with pink gills nibbled at an insect just beneath the surface. A dragonfly zipped across the pond, a blaze of neon green. Her toad brain latched onto the insect's emerald colour and held in its cortex like an amulet, even as its nostrils filled with the sudden stink of fish slime and putrid mud. How had she not noticed the stagnant, vile smell of the shallows before? A muddy chill nettled her leathery skin, prodding her to back out of the foul water. The skin, it was time to shed again. The shudder began involuntarily as it had once a week since her toad memory began. Her body writhed, compelled by an uncontrollable urge as the outer layer of skin stretched and lifted, sliding loose from feet, back, and tender belly. Tugging and twisting with her forelimbs, she pulled the spent casting over her head, like a woman removing a sheer nightgown. Then she gathered the wad of skin in her mouth and began to swallow. Yes, she must always remember to do that, though the reason flickered just outside the grasp. She blinked hard, maneuvering the skin deeper into the gullet, when a queer stirring in the bones halted her mid-swallow. Her insides churned and tumbled, and she coughed the skin back up. A lacerating sting like shooting, tearing into flesh, gripped her hunched back. Panic ignited her instincts. Jump back to the water before old Fox takes another toe with his teeth. But then her other mind, the one that had been wrapped and tucked away like a jewel deep within her subconscious, snapped away. The hidden emerald of intelligence recognized the pain, with a sign of hope that it was. It had her hold steady even as the fissure opened along her spine, agony nearly splitting her in two. Sprayed toes dug into the mud as 4 phalanges morphed into 5. A human face pressed beneath the speckled skin, forcing the toadish nostrils and mouth to tear and peel away. The metamorphoses accelerated, shoulders, arms, and stomach grew. Brown hair, slick with this sort of earth slime, coiled down her back. She gasped for air, filled her lungs, and opened her eyes to the world reborn. Still squatting in the mud, she wriggled her fingers, testing, then dared to hold them in a sacred pose as if cradling the face of knowledge itself. Warmth engulfed her, consciousness reignited, the bonds of the curse disintegrate. Elena. The name flashed in her mind so quickly she thought it was a phantom whisper. Then memory flooded in. She was Elena, disciple of the all-knowing and daughter of the Chanceau Valley, and she was free. As her body woke from the torpor, muddy hands trailed over breast, rib, and stomach, assuring all was normal until warm flesh turned pond water cold beneath her touch. She dared look down, and a strangled scream caught in her throat. Giant speckled legs with webbed feet clung on in horrid stubbornness. She kicked and thrashed, and yet they remained grotesquely fused on her body. What demon's spell is this? She cried. But when panic failed her, she took a steady breath and let her mind meditate on the problem, as she always had. The powerful alkaloids secreted through the skin had eroded the curse over time. Perhaps all she needed was one last jolt to complete the change. Mastering her revulsion, she picked up the spit-toad skin and snuffed it onto the back of her tongue. The toxic residue tasted of rotted reed grass and bitter herbs, but as the sun hallowed in her vision and the poison danced in her blood, she gave thanks to the all-knowing for teaching her well the ways of magic. After one last agonizing moment, her transformation was complete. Long legs, weak but willing, held her when she stood, so she tipped her face toward the daylight stars to calculate the distance home. Naked, but no longer at the mercy of the sun for warmth, she walked out of the marshland with the hot pulse of revenge beating beneath her breastbone.
Right, there's no monkeys about. This is a true story. The haunting of West Belfast and how a family fled a violent ghost in 1989. The headlines in the Anderston Town News read, "In the name of God, what do you want? No respite for a haunted house family." Reports of people being beaten up and having to flee their homes were almost a daily occurrence in the bloodstained Belfast of the 1980s. But such attacks were usually carried out by paramilitaries, but not a violent black-clad Victorian woman who would suddenly appear out of thin air. That's allegedly what caused the Skillen family to flee their home in 91 Beechmount Grove in West Belfast in June 1989. The so far unexplained experiences of the Skillens made the front page headlines and TV news reports in June that year. Father of the family, John Skillen, reported having his face slapped and his head smashed off the walls and fireplace of the house by the apparition, which suddenly started appearing in the house one day. What happened also was witnessed by neighbours, friends, and even a priest who were drawn to the house by the bizarre happenings. But the relentless cycle of tragedy caused during the Troubles, plus the international events such as the bloody end of the Tiananmen Square protest that month, meant that the startling accounts of what was going on in the house were soon forgotten. The Beechmount case was once again came back into public attention, thanks in part to the Irish podcast series, the Real Life Ghost Stories, and helped by members of the 14 Times online forum, which collects and discusses accounts of strange phenomenon. It's the second poltergeist haunting to have come back to the fore after the infamous alleged haunting at Queen's University's Allenbrook Hall, which made for a popular episode hit of BBC podcast series Uncanny. The first mention of unusual goings on in the long since demolished 91 Beechmount Grove appeared in a small news story in the front page of the Irish News on Wednesday, June the 7th, 1989. And the headline was Belfast Ghost Scare. It reported 100 men, women, and children had gathered outside the house upon hearing what was going on. It told of an older woman reciting prayers, while one neighbour said, "I don't know what's going on, but it's beyond my understanding. I don't know what is going on, but the one thing I know is that the man who lives there is not the panicky type. It must have been very strange to frighten him to those lengths." Following the report, it wasn't long before the cameras of UTV arrived, accompanied by reporter Ivan Little. Local weekly paper, the Anderson Town News, kept up with the story and reported that Saturday how a number of priests had been called to the house to reassure the family. It also recounted how the spectral woman had smashed a window, locked John in the toilet, and knocked a glass from his wife Greta's hand. Tom Mallon, its Ghostbuster reporter, spoke to one neighbour who said, "This may all seem a little bit like a joke, but this family are not the kind of people to make something like this up." While the daily media moved on, the Andersonstown News kept up the story, and within 2 weeks of the haunting was said to be so bad that the Skillens fled the house, as reported in the paper's front page. Under the headline, "In the name of God, what do you want? No respite for a haunted family," it told how the 7-strong Skillen family are now staying with relatives. Greta said that the housing executive was putting a new family in the property and had little sympathy for their plight. "If we stay in the house all night, she'll appear to my husband. He's been thrown against the wall. My sons have been slapped around the head," she explained to the paper. "My husband asked, 'What in the name of God do you want?' And it said, 'Get out.'" It also reported how a small group of people had maintained a 3-week vigil outside the home where they recited the rosary. John then wrote his own account of what the family experienced in a book entitled Number 91, A Belfast Ghost Story. The book is now rare and copies are offered for sale online recently for almost £100. Excerpts from the books were the basis of 2 episodes of real-life ghost stories which looked back on the case. In the self-penned work, Mr. Skillen explained how he first saw the woman one night as he came out of the bathroom, but vanished as soon as she appeared. He also put it down to the light and shadows. Later on that night, when he went to check the children hadn't left the bathroom taps on before bed, he suddenly found the bathroom plunged into darkness and the door slammed behind him. Mr. Skillen was convinced he could feel the woman stalk around him before the door suddenly opened and he was met by his son. This was the start of the escalation of unexplained activity in the house caused by the apparition, which would quickly turn violent. The physical interaction began with Mr. Skillen having his hair pulled and his face slapped as he tried to get to sleep that night. The next night, one confrontation with the apparition in the presence of his wife and her friend, it grabbed Mr. Skillen and hanged his head off the wall. Mr. Skillen recalled her unbelievable strength and how it was just like paper in her hands. Another attack saw it grab his head and bang it off a radio. Then another man came to his aid. He was punched in the head by the entity and went flying across the room. Similar incidents would happen in the following days, with Mr. Skillen being punched and even thrown in the air against a wall. The family would eventually leave the house on the advice of a priest who believed staying there would put them at risk. Before they left, a neighbour, Mikey, told Mr. Skillen that his wife had seen an apparition in their home a year before, the description exactly matching that of the woman attacking him. In two further attempts to return to the house, Mr. Skillen was again violently attacked by the woman. The occurrences at Beachmount Grove have never been explained in the area and the area has since been redeveloped. It is believed Mr. Skillen and his wife have since passed away, and the Skillen children do not wish to discuss the traumatic events of June 1989. And that was a report from the Belfast Telegraph.
If the apocalypse comes, my love, I'll shield your body from kamikaze angels until I've assembled the 10 swords, bladed pinion feathers, and peeled all over my back. You went and soft and safe underneath my shield of flesh and bone. I'll study old conspiracist Bibles and para-religious pamphlets of paranoia, learning how to disable any bomb, how to weave the best zigzags. With your hand in mine, avoiding landmines, playing chicken with missiles. I roast roadkill over fire pits, assembled all by myself, my muscles growing thick from foraging for fungi, climbing up to the tallest branches to snatch the squirrel and the walnut, from dark moth fowls and set traps for mutant monsters. My skin will sit tight upon my bones as I sneak tender morsels from my plate to yours. I'll lockpick and ransack the dwellings of World War II enthusiasts and neo-Nazis rotting in basement bunkers. I'll steal all their gas masks to keep your dainty lungs clean of noxious fumes and toxic fires of bio-war. If the apocalypse comes, my love, I will raise down every machine, gun-wielding mannequin, and salt the earth behind me until you and I remain the sole survivors. Poems by Abra Marcati, who's a queer author.
On a dark Halloween Eve in a sleepy town near Belfast, Joseph was feeling the anxiety of the coming darkness. In the past few days, the house had been creaking more than usual. Fleeting figures seen out of the corner of his eye, but vanished when he looked in that direction. Then there was the incident. No, mustn't think about it. No, mustn't think about it. Too late. I'm thinking about it. I was asleep, most likely snoring, dreaming even, and then I was awakened with a start by massive banging on the walls, ceiling, the floor. Couldn't tell what direction it was coming from. It wasn't a physical banging, like I couldn't feel the bricks vibrating or the ceiling shaking. It was almost as if the spaces between the atoms in the room were being violently compressed by an unseen force. Awakened into pure darkness and panic, sweat trickling down my back. What the hell was making that noise? In the air in the room was thick with evil. I could feel the oppressive energy upon me like a weighted blanket. Eyes open, eyes closed, it didn't matter. No difference. It all looked the same, and I realized I had frozen in fear, barely breathing, but lungs bursting to gasp for air. After an age, my eyes adjusted, and I could just make out the faint outline of the door frame. The light switch was beside it. But to go there, I had to look. I had to look out onto the landing where I had seen it, just standing there, staring at me, the source of the evil. I decided I had to risk it, and with one swift move, jumped up, stretched my arm out towards the light switch, and click, in an instant, everything snapped into its rightful place. Still, colourful, non-threatening. It's just a room. It's just clothes. It's just a mess. I made it to the bathroom across the landing. It was still deeply unpleasant walking across the imprint of where the thing was only moments ago. Walking across the top of the stairs, and I can't help but think, what if it pushes me down the stairs in one big paranormal shove? Who would know what happened to me? Who would ever suspect that it was a demon and not the demon drink? Who would believe? I barely believe it myself, except I have to, because it's happening to me. I'm too tired for this crap. I sleep with the bathroom light on. It gives me reassurance every time my eyes open, which is many, many times. I hug my pillow so tight and try to sleep till morning. Morning comes and it's grey and gloomy, and there's not much light. Every light in the house is on, and yet the gloom hangs on my soul like a flu that I can't shake. I know I will have to face this thing to get rid of it. I'll have to fight it. I'll have to win that fight. But how do you fight what you can't see? How do you know if it's even real? My scientific and logic thought process tell me it's not real, but my gut is sounding an alarm I can't ignore. My senses are firing on high alert, and I have to make the call I am dreading, the call to ask for help with something, because then that makes it real. The voice on the other end of the phone is calm. He asks questions like, what time was it when the being manifested? Did you notice any strange or foul smells? A joke springs to mind about foul smells, but now is so not the time. I'm speaking to a witch stroke high priest stroke demon hunter, someone who takes these things seriously. I met him in an online forum during a short period when I was obsessed with otherworldly stuff. He arrives later, and my heart is about to burst. This is happening. He is tall, he is dark, and so very handsome, just like the fortune teller said he would be. I had an immediate crush on him and began planning our wedding. It would be a beach wedding. No, a winter ice chapel under the northern lights. No, focus. Demons now, weddings later. He opened his bag and started unpacking his demon hunting kit. There was an altar cloth, a metal bowl. It looked burnt. Some sage, candles, salt, water, all these fascinating things that I had read about and seen in my favourite TV show, Charmed. He performed a cleansing ritual and cast a circle in the kitchen and told me to stay inside the circle for safety while he vanquished the demon. He lit the sage and began chanting as he made his way to the stairs. As he climbed each step, the energy went weird. The lights began flickering and I closed my eyes. The chanting became more intense in his strong baritone voice in Latin. De leo te ad unde venistis, de leo te ad unde venistis, sto in circulus lucius. The chanting reached its peak. The lights were flickering, and all of a sudden, boom! One of the bulbs on the landing popped above his head. And then it was over. He came back down the stairs, finished the ritual, and closed the circle. He said that there had been an entity attracted to my negative energy and was feeding off it, using me like a battery or demonic takeaway. He asked what I did for a living, and I told him I was a grief counsellor, and he said that made sense. He said it could come back as energy in the house and in me was still low vibrational frequency, and until I raised my vibration, I would remain vulnerable. I asked him what I could do to raise the vibrational frequency in the house, and he said high energy events need to take place in the house to replace the old energy. He said it had to start in the bedroom, and he would like to help. He leaned in and whispered, "If you would like to find out what else happened, like and subscribe to our channel, LGBT Heritage NI."
My name is Vincent Roberts, and I am recounting to you the events that happened several years ago in the summer of 1998. My psychiatrist says that if I write it all down, things might begin to make sense, as though I haven't replayed it in my head hundreds, even thousands of times before. Oh, and by the way, if you're wondering, no, I am not crazy. My test results show that I have no sign of psychosis. I've been recommended several doctors, neurologists, mental health experts over the years, and they all conclude I am certifiably in sound mind. No one believes my story. Heck, I wouldn't either, because it defies belief. I wish it were a lie, an elaborate fabrication. But those who know me best know I have no flair for imagination. I'm committing my story to paper, and I will be as detailed as I can. I invite you to judge for yourself the events that took place that strange summer of 98. I had recently moved from Boston to the small town of Falmouth, Massachusetts. I had been a classical pianist with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, but an unfortunate repetitive back injury meant I had to take a period of leave to recover properly. This was a short-term arrangement, a sabbatical of sorts. I was annoyed. I'd worked ceaselessly for several years, and I'm not being boastful when I say I had a growing reputation as a celebrated pianist. My injury, however, required time for recovery. Wanting a fresh start following a recent breakup with my girlfriend Susan, I decided I needed a change of scenery, so I asked around, and before I knew it, I had accepted a job as a professor at the Falmouth Music School. So that July, I packed up my tiny apartment and headed to the Cape, to the picturesque town of Falmouth. I settled into life quickly. My colleagues were mostly like me, ex-musicians, easy to get on with, the job undemanding. Sure, it wasn't groundbreaking work. I wasn't teaching musical prodigies, but I enjoyed this new pace of life compared to the demands back in the big city. I was beginning to see the appeal of the Cape. On my free days, I went swimming and surfing. I even started composing my own music with ambitions to record an album. A change is as good as a rest, or so they say. Life was good. That was until a phone call from Susan. We'd split up a while back, so I was surprised to hear from her. Her mother was sick, very sick. She needed to see a specialist in Canada, but her health insurance wouldn't cover it. In short, Susan needed money, and I knew it was serious because she was a proud woman who wouldn't ask unless absolutely necessary. Wasn't wealthy by any means, but I told her I could do what I could. So when I saw a notice requiring a piano tutor for an 8th grade student in the college one day, I did not hesitate to apply. What I would give to turn back the clock and not apply for the job. That evening, I called the number on the advert, and after a few rings, a husky voice answered. It was a strange voice, unlike one I'd ever heard before, female, raspy. She sounded old, perhaps retired. I said, "Hi, my name is Vincent Roberts, and I saw your ad for music tuition in the music school. I'm a piano professor there, and I'm interested in the position." There was a strangely long pause, and finally the voice said, "Mr. Roberts, I'm so glad you called. My name is Mrs. Hale. I require a teacher for my niece. She is 9 years old and plays at an exceptional level for her years." We discussed the details. Mrs. Hale and her niece lived half an hour away in a house called the Rectory on the other side of the Cape, where I'd not been before. I was to come and meet them that Friday after work. Being new to town, I didn't exactly have a thriving social life, so I didn't mind working on the weekend. So off I set for the Rectory. Having lived in the city for so long, I didn't have a car, so I resolved to get a bus after work. Packing up my desk around 6, the janitor Carl asked me what I was doing this weekend. He was polite, feigning an interest in me, a newcomer. I got a tutoring job at the rectory west side of the Cape, I replied. With hindsight, Carl's reaction should have alerted me. His friendly face seemed to suddenly stiffen as though he had seen a ghost. I thought that house was empty after the accident. What happened? I said, my interest piqued. There was an accident there many years ago, a long time ago now. But as I say, it must be sold to new owners. Carl replied, obviously keen to change the subject. Carl's reaction was somewhat troubling, actually more odd than troubling, but I shrugged off the ill feeling. I was going to teach piano to a 9-year-old girl, and I assumed her elderly aunt, so clearly there was no reason to be concerned. I boarded a bus around 6:30 outside the college. Oddly, there was no one at the stop waiting with me, and odder still, the bus completely empty when I got on. 6:30 was rush hour even in the Cape. I was immediately uncomfortable with the bus driver. In Boston, when you board a bus, the drivers are nonchalant, they barely acknowledge you. But this driver was staring at me, staring intently from the moment the bus pulled up. He was young, 19 at most, exceptionally clean cut, wearing a polo shirt with a name tag that read Brad. In his youthful sharpness, Brad looked like a milkman from the 1950s. Coast Road, please, I said, handing him $5. Brad did not drop his intense stare. Single or return, he asked, his voice surprisingly baritone for one so young. Return, I replied quickly. Now Brad was gazing intently into my eyes. Being so close to him, I could smell something rancid. Trying to conceal my disgust and discomfort under his stare, I longed for this exchange to end. Terrible business, I thought I heard him say under his breath, all the while still holding my gaze. Pardon me, I said, confused. Last bus back's at 10. I felt his eyes on me as I walked to the back of the bus and sat down. Jeez, what a weird guy. Was Brad a college student driving buses on the side? I couldn't have been older than 20, and why was he staring at me? I became very self-conscious that I had food on my teeth or something on my shirt. I tried to shrug off all the thoughts of Brad and listen to my Walkman during the journey. Closed my eyes and listened to some music, classical, of course. Must have dozed off because when I woke, we were at the last stop, which was my stop. To my surprise, Brad hadn't picked any other passengers up. Strange. Last stop, Coast Road, said Brad. I picked up my coat and bag and headed to the front of the bus. I muttered thanks, purposely avoiding Brad's stare, which I could feel penetrating on me. Suddenly, Brad reached out and grabbed my arm frantically. I jerked back instinctively. His touch was ice cold, and a feeling of deep unpleasantness went through my whole body like an electric current. It wasn't my fault, I didn't see, shouted Brad with pleadingly desperate eyes. At this point, I seriously considered if Brad had a mental disorder. Still reeling from his icy cold touch, I somehow stammered, I don't know what you mean. Then the bus door opened and I drove off. I did not hesitate to exit it hastily. The bus drove off. What had just happened? A maniac was driving that bus. I would get a cab home for sure. Why had Brad felt so cold? It was like the touch of a corpse. A cold that had gone through me. No human had ever felt like this before. Maybe he had a health problem or was on drugs. He was clearly a maniac grabbing a passenger. Then anger rose in me. What if I'd been a woman? I would call the bus company in the morning and issue a complaint. I tried to shrug off all thoughts of Brad and the bus as I adjusted to my surroundings. Mrs. Hale told me that the rectory lay down the beside a dirt track. A weather vane in the distance would herald I was heading in the right way. It was dusk now. I looked at my watch. It read 6:45 p.m. Following the instructions, I turned the corner and the house came into full view. I can only describe it as awesome. A grand, pale blue Victorian house stood imposingly at the end of the lane. It was magnificent with the veranda and shutters. A baby grand would be in there, I was sure. When I made my way up to the porch, Mrs. Hale was standing there waiting for me. Or was it for me? She seemed to be gazing intently off into the distance. I didn't notice from afar, but up close she looked very strange. Mid-50s, long grey hair and a tight bun, wearing white evening gloves and what appeared to be a hooped skirt with cherries on the pattern. She wore a pearl necklace, the kind I'd seen my mother wear in old photographs. She looked like she could have been on the cover of Good Housekeeping. "How do you do, Mr. Roberts?" she said, extending her dainty hand to mine. "We are so glad you could join us this evening." A young girl with bright red hair appeared wearing a dress in a similarly antiquated style. "This is my niece, Caroline." At this introduction, Caroline handed me a glass of lemonade with a curtsy and said, "Good evening, Mr. Roberts." A strangely formal way for a 9-year-old to act. It seemed there was something forced in this exchange. "You must be parched after your journey," Mrs. Hale continued. Truthfully, my mouth was rather dry, so I welcomed the lemonade. I noticed that Mrs. Hale and Caroline were not partaking, but not wanting to appear rude, I downed the whole glass. A thought crossed my mind. Maybe they were Mormons. It would explain the old-fashioned outfits and strange formality. The inside of the house was as impressive as the outside. I was led into the music room, as they called it. There was an old-fashioned golden music box on top of a mahogany dresser, with a ballerina circling around the centre, playing what appeared to be a nursery rhyme. I had a feeling of deja vu, as though I had heard this song somewhere before. Something along the lines of, "In this song, you're forever mine." I was gazing at the box when Mrs. Hale and Caroline re-entered the room. Now that my eyes were off the box, I noticed how strange the room actually was. There was something otherworldly about it, extremely antiquated. Forest green, velvet drapes, an old-timey gramophone. The table was a dark mahogany, and there was what looked to me like doilies on the velvet chairs. There were photographs on an old-fashioned dresser of what I assumed were long-deceased relatives. One stood out, a portrait of a young man clad in military regalia. The brief thought that Mrs. Hale was a Vietnam widow crossed my mind. "Caroline, would you like to play a few pieces?" "Caroline would like to play a few pieces she's worked hard on, a recital of sorts for you," Mrs. Hale continued. "But not in here, come," she said, taking me by my arm and leading me into a dark hallway. A recital by means of our first meeting was indeed strange, but I obliged willingly. Mrs. Hale led me into a magnificent room solely lit by candlelight. There was a stage in the centre of the room. What I assumed to be a piano was covered by dark cloth. Caroline took her position at the instrument on the stage, and Mrs. Hale drew back the cloth, revealing, as I had anticipated, a stunning baby grand piano. Not only was it opulent, but it looked vintage, circa 1900. I couldn't help but gasp at this decadent revelation. Mrs. Hale seemed to appreciate my reaction. "This is quite something," I said. "Before the music commences, it is right for me to say a few words. My niece and I have been looking for quite some time to find a man of your particular talents for this very special performance. And I know you are the right person to appreciate this recital," said Mrs. Hale. In the candlelight, Mrs. Hale seemed to look considerably younger and radiant even. Pearl necklace illuminated in the darkness. I must say at this point, whilst I found this situation all very odd, I did not feel particularly scared. That came much later. Caroline commenced playing. Living up to her word, she was indeed an exceptional talent, surpassing the talent of the students of the conservatoire where I taught. As the performance continued, the darkness of the room seemed to envelop me as if the music had an intoxicating effect. I began to feel extremely drowsy. The melodic music enchanted me into a slumber-like state to the point I almost forgot Mrs. Hale was beside me. Then I heard her whisper, "This is the final piece." Looking at her face, it appeared her eyes were glowing red and she seemed to be in a trance-like state, rocking back and forth in the chair violently. "Mrs. Hale," I said, alarmed, "are you all right?" But she looked right through me, her eyes transfixed on some static spot on the piano. I noticed the tempo of the music had picked up quite considerably, and Caroline's frantic fingers were playing the same song I had heard coming from the music box earlier. Suddenly, as the song grew to a crescendo, Mrs. Hale's eyes closed and her breathing returned to normal, recovering from what at the time I assumed to be some kind of fit. and then I could have sworn I heard her whisper goodbye to Vincent. What happened next, I still cannot fathom after all this time. I must have been asleep because when I regained consciousness, there was no one in the room. Candles were lit, but Caroline and Mrs. Hill were absent. My initial thoughts were that something in the lemonade had made me drowsy, and I had embarrassingly fallen asleep during the recital, and to spare me any further embarrassment, they had slipped out into another room. That or Mrs. Hill actually had some kind of fit and they were in the emergency room. But why not wake me if that was the case? I walked back across the hallway and into the music room holding a candle. The lights seemed to be out in every room. I kept calling Mrs. Hill, Caroline, for what seemed like an eternity. I expected to find them waiting for me in one of the rooms, but there was no one there. This was incredibly odd. I looked at my watch, midnight. How had I been there so long? I considered maybe I had been drugged, but why? I didn't own anything valuable, and they were clearly not in need of money. I looked in the kitchen, the reception room, and I kept calling out, but there was no response. Then I felt scared. What if they were in danger? I considered calling 911, but what would I say? There was no forced entry, no bodies, just two people disappeared from their own house. I packed my bags to leave and saw a note on the table. It read, "I knew you would enjoy this final performance, Mr. Roberts. Yours truly, Lee Hero." There was $50, but it wasn't normal currency, some old money, the kind my grandmother had showed me when I was a kid. What was going on? Why'd they pay me with old money? What was even more unsettling was that Mrs. Hill's pearl necklace was also sitting with the note clearly intended for me. I resolved I would walk home as the bus was already rolled out and I didn't know a number for a cab. I walked for probably half an hour in the dark, only half certain I was heading in the right direction. The strange events of the night kept playing out in my head. The lemonade, the recital, the fit, the disappearance. It had been so odd. Around 1 a.m., a car pulled up beside me. It was Jerry, a student from my class. He was on his way back from performing at a wedding and he had seen me walking beside the road. He gave me a ride home. Not prepared to explain the events of the evening, at least I looked crazy. I told him I was at a party at the old rectory instead. That night I couldn't sleep. I took the pearls and the 50 out of my pocket and placed them on my dresser. I was convinced myself that the morning would herald an explanation. I was certain Mrs. Gill would call. But no call came the next day. I called the number on the advert and it said, "Number not recognized." Now I felt sick. I redialed it 5 or so times, painstakingly checking I was hitting the right digits. But it kept saying, "Number not recognized." I considered returning to the house. I could hitch a ride with a co-worker, but then I need to tell them what happened, and I didn't know how to even begin to explain. I called the hospital, but no one with the name Hale had been admitted. I was agitated at work. I couldn't concentrate. I needed answers. I knew there had been some kind of accident at the house many years ago, so I headed to the public records office to find out anything I could. "Do you have any information about the old rectory in Close Road?" I asked at the desk. The lady returned with a file. Inside there was a newspaper article from 1958 with the headline, "Young girl and aunt killed by bus on way to music recital." My blood ran cold. There was a photograph of Mrs. Hill and Caroline in the exact same clothes they had worn the night of our recital. Under the photograph it read, "Caroline and Viola Hill pictured just before the accident." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then I noticed another photograph of the driver. It read, "Bus driver Brad Smith, 19, also killed." It was the bus driver from my journey. I immediately ran to the bathroom and vomited. How could they be dead? I had spoken to them clear as day. And then I remembered Brad's icy cold touch. Many years have passed since that July evening. I was never one to believe in ghosts, supernatural, but I can find no other conclusion to the events of that night. I have accepted that Caroline and Mrs. Hale wanted an opportunity to perform for the final time to someone who would appreciate the music, a chance they were robbed of in this earthly world. It took me a long time to play the piano again, and when I do, I never ever play on a baby grand.